Hello there. Tonight, we're stepping into the quiet, cobbled streets of a medieval city where curfews were strict, shoes had laws, and even dinner sounds could get you fined. Strange rules once shaped everyday life in ways that feel distant and yet oddly familiar. So, settle in. Let your eyes rest. Are you watching from a warm bed? Or maybe it's the middle of the night where you are. Let me know below. And if you enjoy drifting through time, consider subscribing for more quiet history. You're walking along the cobbled lanes of 13th century Toulouse. The morning bells toll gently from St. Sernin, and you notice something odd. The townsfolk stroll, barefoot adults, children, even finely dressed merchants. Their boots and sandals hang from belts or are left at home entirely. The reason? A moral ordinance, passed quietly by the city council and enforced by parish watchers. No shoes on Sundays, in the name of humility. Toulouse, like many medieval cities, was governed not only by civic leaders but by a powerful blend of religious oversight and moral expectations. These local laws, sometimes written, often whispered, were rooted in the belief that civic discipline and divine favor were deeply intertwined. Sunday was the Lord's Day, and wearing shoes was seen as a sign of pride and vanity. To walk barefoot through the town was to honor the humility of Christ. To refuse was to risk both a fine and a quiet kind of social condemnation. But it wasn't just about walking barefoot. This was one of hundreds of small rules imposed by medieval councils, rules governing behavior, clothing, gestures, even laughter, in public places. In Toulouse, excessive smiling could be read as flirtation. Too much jewelry could draw the attention of the bishop's guards. These restrictions, collectively called ordinances of public decency, blurred the line between sin and crime. They were enforced by local constables, but often upheld more harshly by one's neighbors, who might whisper complaints behind linen curtains or offer your name during Sunday confession. Records from 1274 show that the city paid 5 sous to a man named Etienne to watch the crossroads for violations of Sabbath decorum. Etienne's job: to ensure that no one, especially women of merchant families, wore silk or leather on holy days. A sandal strap made of dyed calfskin could bring shame upon an entire household. You may wonder, did these laws matter in a time when literacy was rare? These daily performances of morality were one of the few ways a city could assert its character. To walk barefoot wasn't just a show of faith, it was a declaration of belonging, of unity, and of fear. But what happened when someone refused? What if a merchant's daughter stepped out in bright red shoes on a quiet Sunday morning? The records from Toulouse in the spring of 1292 mention her only briefly, and not even by name. The shoemaker's daughter fined 2 deniers for breach of the Sabbath ordinance. But local tradition, passed through parish chronicles and the oral accounts of guild scribes, expands on this curious little moment. It's said she wore bright red shoes, dyed with madder root, a costly color usually reserved for saints' altarpieces or noble coats. They were soft, tightly stitched, with small brass studs at the heel. She wore them, some say, not out of defiance, but simply because the morning was cold and the street was filled with broken glass after a festival night. Others insist she wore them proudly, flaunting her father's skill and her own rising status. Among the artisan class, what followed was a perfect example of how medieval cities enforced their rules, not only through law, but through spectacle. The girl was summoned not to a court, but to the front of her parish church. There, before Sunday Mass, she was asked to remove the shoes and walk barefoot through the nave, while a deacon read aloud from the book of Proverbs. Her father, the shoemaker, was made to kneel beside her, his leather tools placed at his feet as a symbol of corrupted labor. For weeks afterward, the story spread through Toulouse like wood smoke. Merchants whispered that the mayor himself had remarked on the boldness of the color. Guild wives clucked their tongues over market baskets, citing her as proof of what happens when daughters are allowed to read too many courtly poems. And yet, quietly, a change began. Young women began hemming their skirts higher to reveal more ankle. The very shame designed to enforce obedience had planted the first seeds of quiet. The rules remained on paper, and Etienne the Sabbath watcher still prowled the corners of Saint-Tram, but fewer fines were issued for colored shoes. And by the early 1300s, a new ordinance replaced the barefoot law with a broader statement about humility in appearance, its specifics left vague, its teeth dulled by time. So often, we imagine history as being changed by kings and wars. But here, in a narrow lane in Toulouse, a shoemaker's daughter broke a rule and nudged the edge of custom, ever so slightly. What other quiet rebellions might have unfolded, hidden in the footnotes of a city's forgotten laws? The year was 1313, and Paris, though bustling by day, fell unnaturally quiet at night. As dusk settled over the Seine and the last carts rumbled back from the markets of Les Halles, a strange ritual unfolded. Candles were snuffed, lanterns extinguished, shutters closed tightly. The streets dimmed, not just from habit, but from law. It was known as the Candle Curfew Ordinance, issued and enforced by the Prvt des Marchands, or the city provost, who acted under the king's shadowy authority. According to the rule, no open flames were allowed to burn after the evening bell, which rang from the bell tower of Saint Choclebutry just as the sun touched the horizon. Any light seen flickering after that moment, whether from a window, a doorstep, or a wandering lamp, was cause for fine suspicion, or worse. But why such a harsh rule in a thriving, growing city? The answer was fear. Fires were the great destroyers of medieval cities. Timber-framed houses stood pressed together like dried tinder. Chimneys were rare, ventilation was poor, and even the smallest spark could race along rooftops like a plague of flame. Paris had already suffered multiple devastating blazes. One in 1210 destroyed entire quarters near the Isle de la Cite. So, the logic behind the curfew was brutally simple: no flame, no fire. Yet this practical concern quickly became a moral one. Darkness bred a certain expected behavior. Paris was to sleep, not scheme. The candle curfew aligned with other ordinances aimed at preserving order and piety. Night was a time for prayer, not poetry; for sleep, not secret rendezvous. Officials believed that visibility encouraged vice, and extinguishing light could extinguish temptation. To walk through the streets of Paris after curfew was to wander in near total darkness, save for the occasional city guard with a horn lantern or the moon peeking through clouds. The wealthy could afford glass-covered lamps, but even these were watched with suspicion. Those found carrying light without permission could be stopped and questioned, and rumors abounded that candles lit after curfew were signs of sorcery, seduction, or seditious writing. In a way, the city became two places: the Paris of daybright, busy, full of noise, and the Paris of night, a shrouded world of whispers, shadows, and silence. But what of those who defied the dark? Some had no choice: midwives, bakers, night soil collectors. And then there were those who lit their candles in secret: scribes, lovers, philosophers, men and women who refused to let the law extinguish their flame. And so, behind thick curtains, a few dared to write read, or think by flickering candlelight. What truths or dangers might have been born in those secret pools of flame. Section 2. Secret lights and silent scribes. Word count 486. In the hush of medieval Parisian nights, long after the bell had rung and the shutters drawn tight, a different city stirred quiet, unseen, and softly illuminated by illegal flames. For those who disobeyed the candle curfew, the darkness was not a prison, but a veil. One such figure was Brother Alaric, a scribe from the monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Though bound by his vow to obey both God and the city's laws, he often bent the latter. With ink-stained fingers and tired eyes, he transcribed manuscripts by the faint light of a beeswax taper, hidden behind layers of heavy cloth nailed across his cell window. His reason was simple. The monastery had been tasked with copying a rare Latin commentary on Galen, and the deadline was approaching. To stop work at dusk would be to fail his prior and worse, delay payment from a noble patron. Alaric wasn't alone. Many scribes, especially those working outside ecclesiastical walls, found themselves pulled into the same dilemma. Literacy was a profession in demand, but the hours of daylight were few, particularly in winter. So, small networks of clandestine scribes began to operate, sometimes gathering in basements or back rooms where candlelight could not betray them. They called it moonwork, and some even created elaborate hoods and visors to block light from escaping windows. The punishments for being caught were more than a slap on the wrist. City guards were authorized to issue stiff fines up to 12 deniers or to confiscate goods. In rare cases, chronic offenders were paraded through the street with extinguished candles tied to their garments, a public symbol of defiance. But enforcement was inconsistent, and some neighborhoods, particularly those near the Latin Quarter, were known to turn a blind eye to a faint flicker behind parchment curtains. For women, the risks were often greater. Widows who took in sewing or copywork by night risked being mistaken for harlots, especially if light was seen in their windows past the bell. One parish decree even warned of female lanterns, a euphemism for women who lit candles, not for labor, but for luring men into sin. This warning blurred the line between poverty, independence, and impropriety, a line that women in particular walked every night the candle stayed lit. Still, they worked, quietly, carefully, in the corners of a city that preferred them sleeping. Paris, in its enforced darkness, became a city of secrets. And in those secret lights, stories were written, ideas preserved, and laws ever so slightly bent. Could it be that some of the most important words of the Middle Ages were penned not in daylight, but in defiance of a bell meant to end thought at dusk? In the hush of medieval Parisian nights, long after the bell had rung and the shutters drawn tight, a different city stirred quiet, unseen, and softly illuminated by illegal flames. For those who disobeyed the candle curfew, the darkness was not a prison, but a veil. One such figure was Brother Alaric, a scribe from the monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Though bound by his vow to obey both God and the city's laws, he often bent the latter. With ink-stained fingers and tired eyes, he transcribed manuscripts by the faint light of a beeswax taper, hidden behind layers of heavy cloth nailed across his cell window. His reason was simple. The monastery had been tasked with copying a rare Latin commentary on Galen, and the deadline was approaching. To stop work at dusk would be to fail his prior and worse, delay payment from a noble patron. Alaric wasn't alone. Many scribes, especially those working outside ecclesiastical walls, found themselves pulled into the same dilemma. Literacy was a profession in demand, but the hours of daylight were few, particularly in winter. So, small networks of clandestine scribes began to operate, sometimes gathering in basements or back rooms where candlelight could not betray them. They called it moonwork, and some even created elaborate hoods and visors to block light from escaping windows. The punishments for being caught were more than a slap on the wrist. City guards were authorized to issue stiff fines up to 12 deniers or to confiscate goods. In rare cases, chronic offenders were paraded through the street with extinguished candles tied to their garments, a public symbol of defiance. But enforcement was inconsistent, and some neighborhoods, particularly those near the Latin Quarter, were known to turn a blind eye to a faint flicker behind parchment curtains. For women, the risks were often greater. Widows who took in sewing or copy work by night risked being mistaken for harlots, especially if light was seen in their windows past the bell. One parish decree even warned of female lanterns, a euphemism for women who lit candles not for labor, but for luring men into sin. This warning blurred the line between poverty, independence, and impropriety, a line that women in particular walked every night the candles stayed lit. Still, they worked, quietly, carefully, in the corners of a city that preferred them sleeping. Paris, in its enforced darkness, became a city of secrets, and in those secret lights, stories were written, ideas preserved, and laws ever so slightly bent. Could it be that some of the most important words of the Middle Ages were penned not in daylight, but in defiance of a bell meant to end thought at dusk? If you had walked the streets of Bologna in the mid-14th century, you wouldn't have needed a clock to know the hour. Time was told not by watches or sundials, but by the campana grosseth, the great bell that hung in the Tor degli Asinelli, echoing its commands across tiled rooftops and stone alleys. More than a timekeeper, the bell was the voice of authority, the city's heartbeat. When it rang, people listened, and more often than not, they moved. In Bologna, bells did more than toll for mass or mark the hours. They regulated civic life with remarkable precision. A short burst from the tower could mean the opening of the market. A slower sequence could announce the closing of the city gates, and once every few days, a distinctive triple ring signaled a mandatory assembly, calling every able-bodied citizen to gather in the Piazza Maggiore to hear decrees, vote on laws, or settle disputes. This bell-controlled routine wasn't unique to Bologna, but here it was refined to an unusual degree. The city's communal government, proud of its independence from both papal and imperial control, leaned heavily on its soundscape to reinforce order. The Campana Grossa became quite literally the city's voice of law at dawn. A mellow chime stirred the market vendors, signaling permission to begin setting up their stalls. At midday, another rang out for the university lectures to pause, and for students who were famously loud and disorderly to return to their lodgings for rest and food. In the evening, a low and deliberate toll reminded everyone to douse their hearths and prepare for curfew. Failure to heed the bell was considered a civic offense. Merchants who delayed stall closures after the second bell could be fined. Students who ignored the call to dispersal were reported to the rectors of their colleges. Even beggars and pilgrims were expected to freeze when the bell summoned a town assembly. They too were part of the city's delicate choreography. But the most curious use of the bell came during emergencies. When war or riot threatened Bologna, a rapid-fire clamor known as the scampanata could summon thousands in minutes. Bakers would leave their ovens. Priests would pause in mid-prayer. Even surgeons would leave the side of patients if they were summoned. The city, in effect, ran on rhythm, yet, like all rhythms, the bell's power depended on agreement. The moment people stopped listening, intentionally or not, the order could collapse. So what happened when the bell rang and no one came? In the spring of 1371, Bologna experienced something almost unthinkable. The bell rang, but the city did not respond. The cause wasn't war or famine, but a dispute far more mundane, a tax on salt. That year, the commune, desperate for funds to support its growing bureaucracy and defend against Florentine influence, issued a levy on salt imports. Salt, as simple as it seems, was vital, used for curing meat, preserving fish, and even paying laborers in part. When the price rose, the working class suffered first. Bakers reduced their loaves, butchers stretched their cuts, and servants found their wages lighter in value. Anger simmered, especially among the artisans and laborers in the parishes around the Eastern Gate. Petitions were sent to the city council. Debates were held in churchyards and taverns. And then came the bell. It was mid-morning when the campana grossa rang out 3 heavy strokes, spaced widely apart. This was the official call to gather for a general consulta town assembly at which grievances could be aired and policies voted upon. Normally, the square would have filled within minutes with guild members, scholars, and citizen voters. But this time, something strange happened. The square stayed quiet. City officials arrived to find a scattering of onlookers, a few curious boys, and no sign of the guild banners that typically fluttered above assembly heads. The cobblers and weavers had stayed in their shops. The fishmongers remained at the portico, and in the taverns along Via Rizzoli, men sat with arms crossed, heads bowed, silently refusing to rise. It wasn't a riot. It was a refusal, a quiet, coordinated ignoring of the very mechanism that gave the commune its authority. For an entire day, Bologna became a city out of sync, a place where the bell rang, but life moved on, unbothered. The council panicked. That same evening, they sent runners to the university rectors and guild heads, pleading for compliance. A decree was issued, suspending the salt tax pending further review, and by the next morning, when the bell tolled again, the people returned, orderly, polite, but unmistakably aware of their own power. It was a lesson the city did not forget. The bell was not lit, was a signal. Its authority came from belief, not bronze, and belief, once shaken, needed time to be reforged. How many other cities lived by sound, and how fragile was the silence that could break them. In the winding lanes of 14th century Norwich, the scent of barley mash drifted through courtyards and alleys, signaling more than supper. It signaled a woman at work. These women were known as alewives, and their brewing kettles were as common as bakers' ovens. In fact, for much of medieval England, brewing was a household task turned civic trade, and one of the few businesses dominated entirely by women. Ale was not a luxury. It was a daily staple, safer to drink than water, and consumed by all classes. Children drank small ale, a low-alcohol version, while adults might enjoy stronger brews, often flavored with herbs like yarrow or rosemary. Brewing was done in small batches, and freshness was essential. Ale could spoil in just a few days. As a result, nearly every street had its own local brewer, and most of them, until the late 15th century, were women. But with ale's importance came regulation. Each town had a group known as aleconers officials, whose job was to inspect, taste, and assess the quality and price of the ale sold. The alewife's work wasn't done when the mash cooled. She had to submit her product for inspection. A weak brew could earn her a fine. an unclean brewing space. Another fine, selling without the appropriate bread ratio. Yet another dot, and then there were the alley rules, municipal codes that governed where brewing could happen. In Norwich, for example, ale could not be boiled near the town wells, nor in alleys too narrow for a horse cart to pass. Fires were a constant threat, and brewing kettles, if tipped or left too hot, could lead to destruction. One ordinance stated plainly, "Let no woman brew in a passage where smoke may not flee." Fines were public and steep. Offending brewers might be summoned before the town court and listed in the leet rolls, their names read aloud during market days. For many women, brewing was a way to support a household or operate independently, but it also brought scrutiny. It wasn't uncommon for neighbors to report one another for poor quality or for brewing at forbidden hours, especially during religious feast days or curfew. And yet, despite the risks, thousands of women brewed. They hung ale straws outside their doors to signal a fresh batch. They passed down yeast cultures, guarded like family secrets. They experimented with herbs and spices, making each house's brew distinct. But as the 15th century drew on, something began to shift. Male brewers, organized into guilds and backed by rising commercial interest, began to encroach. The image of the alewife changed from respected provider to suspect character, even a figure of ridicule. What happens when the rules of a trade shift, not because of failure, but because of gender and growing profit? By the early 1500s, the smell of brewing still drifted through English towns, but the hands stirring the kettles were no longer mostly women's. The alewife, once the backbone of daily drink and neighborhood economy, was slipping from the scene. The change didn't come suddenly, but steadily, through a tightening web of laws, reputation, and economics. Guilds were at the center of the shift. As brewing scaled from household production to larger commercial ventures, male brewers formed trade guilds, fraternities of skill and privilege, often excluding women. While some towns allowed women to join under special terms, most guilds required fees, formal apprenticeships, or male sponsorship barriers few women could cross. Brewing also became tied to property rights, as cities began to formalize where and how ale could be sold. Owning or leasing a space became essential. A woman brewing from her home hearth could be fined for lacking a licensed premises. In places like Bristol and York, laws began to require fixed brewing facilities with proper drainage, inspection records, and storage, a far cry from the small copper pots and wooden tubs women had used for generations. But it wasn't only regulation that changed the story. Public perception turned hostile. In church sermons and satirical ballads, the alewife became a target. She was portrayed as greedy, unclean, dishonest, serving watered-down ale or seducing men into sin. One common woodcut from the period shows a haggard woman stirring a cauldron beside a demon, with the phrase, "alewife of the devil," inscribed beneath. This image was no accident. It served a growing cultural discomfort with women who worked outside the home, controlled money, and held local authority in something as ordinary as drink. Ale, once a shared staple, was becoming a regulated commodity, and as profit entered the picture, so too did power. Control over brewing meant control over trade, and guilds had no intention of sharing that control with women. There were exceptions, of course. Some widows inherited their husbands' brewing licenses. A few strong-willed women fought for their place in the industry, sometimes operating taverns or inns where they brewed on-site. But even these were subject to growing scrutiny. By the mid-16th century, most alewives had disappeared from city records, their names replaced by brewer or innkeeper. nearly always male. The alley finds and ale conners remained but the women who once stirred. Norwich's kettles were now only remembered when their batches went bad. What was lost when brewing moved from hearth to hall? Was it only the taste of the aleor, something more quietly essential to community and care? In the medieval town of Coventry, and in dozens like it across England, bread was more than food. It was a unit of trust, and one of the most tightly regulated commodities in daily life. You might think a loaf of bread was just a matter of flour and fire, but for the medieval baker, every crumb was a legal matter. The standard loaf, often called the assize loaf, was regulated under nationwide law known as the Assize of Bread and Ale, first established in the 13th century. This law dictated the exact weight a loaf must have for a given price, which in turn depended on the fluctuating cost of grain. If the harvest was bad and grain expensive, bakers were expected to shrink the size of their loaves accordingly, but never alter the price. In theory, this protected both the buyer and the market. In practice, it created a minefield of oversight. Each town had a group of bread weighers, often appointed by the mayor, who conducted regular inspections of bakeries. These officials would carry small iron weights and portable scales, knocking on ovens unannounced to test a morning's batch. A loaf found light-even by an ounce could result in a fine, and repeated offenses could see a baker's oven bricked shut, their tools confiscated. But these regulations, meant to preserve fairness, were entangled with quiet forms of taxation. While the price of the loaf remained fixed by law, hidden fees and licensing costs crept into the cost of doing business. In many towns, bakers were required to pay oven rent to the mayor's office, a fee for the right to operate a baking hearth. Others paid levies on flour storage, wood purchases, or even the location of their shop. These expenses were unofficial, rarely written, and yet widely enforced. The most symbolic of these taxes was the mayor's loaf. In some towns, every baker was required to deliver a large ceremonial loaf to the mayor's household each month. Ostensibly, it was a goodwill gesture, a thank you for civic protection and inspection services. But everyone understood it as a quiet form of tribute. Bakers who delayed or under-delivered might find themselves visited by inspectors more frequently, or worse, whispered about in the town court rolls. Still, bread was a daily need. Bakers rarely went out of business, but they did grow cautious, even clever. Some began making loaves with thick crusts and hollow centers, pushing the legal edge of the weight requirement. Others baked extra loaves, known as inbread, or bread of mercy, to hand out freely in case of inspection. But what happened when even the mayor's bread wasn't enough to keep the peace? In the year 1381, the city of Winchester, like many English towns, was under pressure. Food prices had crept upward after several poor harvests, and tensions between city officials and guild artisans were beginning to show. Among the most quietly burdened were the bakers, who bore the weight of the assize of bread while quietly absorbing hidden costs, bribes, and growing demands from the mayor's court. The spark came not from a riot, but a missing loaf. That spring, one of the town's wealthiest bakers, Agnes Lagatebooker, failed to deliver her monthly mayor's loaf. No explanation was recorded. Some said her flour had spoiled. Others whispered she had simply grown tired of paying tribute for the right to perform her trade. The mayor's clerk issued a public reprimand and ordered her ovens inspected. But when the inspectors arrived, they found not only Agnes absent, but her oven cold, her tools locked away. She wasn't alone. In a coordinated act that surprised the city council, 10 bakers in including both women and men, ceased production for an entire market week. Their stalls stood empty. The smell of baking vanished from the high street. No bread was sold in the main square, and housewives were forced to bake at home or barter for stale loaves from nearby villages. The protest was quiet, even polite but unmistakable. It came with a letter, signed with the seals of multiple baking households, declaring that no more mayor's loaves would be delivered unless the hidden rents and inspection bribes were formally acknowledged and reduced. The letter also requested a clearer register of allowed baking weights, updated according to grain quality and labor costs. At first, the city council responded with threats. They posted a decree requiring all bakers to resume work or forfeit their shop space. But then something unexpected happened. The public sided with the bakers. Neighbors brought firewood to their homes, carried flour in sacks, and helped deliver small batches of bread to hospitals and convents. A minor food crisis was narrowly avoided, but the council now saw that open punishment might lead to broader unrest. After all, this was the same year that peasants across England had begun to rebel against taxes and labor laws. The wind, it seemed, was changing. Eventually, a compromise was reached. While the assize remained in place, the mayor's loaf became voluntary, and licensing fees were capped for smaller ovens. Agnes returned to her stall, and her bread dense, slightly salted, with a thick crusts, sold out within hours. The loaves stayed the same, but something in the balance of power had shifted. In a world ruled by rules and weights, could a loaf of bread really be an act of quiet resistance? Imagine yourself crossing London Bridge in the early 1400s, not the wide, open crossing of modern postcards, but a bustling narrow thoroughfare lined on both sides with houses, shops, and chapels, stacked like crooked teeth above the Thames. The bridge was not merely a passage, it was a micro-city, home to merchants, beggars, butchers, barbers, and booksellers. And within this cramped world, there were rules and written codes of etiquette that governed how a person moved, where they stood, and even how they breathed. Most famously, Londoners were expected to keep to the left, not by statute, but by long-practiced convention. On the crowded stone path between timber structures, 2 lanes of human traffic had to flow. Carts, footmen, apprentices, and monks all passed side by side. To break the leftward flow was to risk confrontation or even physical shoving. The convention became so embedded that travelers from other towns were often mocked or corrected with surprising firmness. They kept right, but the etiquette extended beyond direction. One must not pause mid-span, especially near the Southwark Gatehouse, where the walkway narrowed and the press of bodies was most intense. Stopping to talk or stare at the water could cause bottlenecks, and those who lingered were often scolded by passing traders or tugged along by city watchmen. Even bowing too slowly to a nobleman's procession was frowned upon if it disrupted the flow. Then there were the finer rules, strange, subtle, and unspoken. Do not spit. The bridge's crowded nature made such acts deeply offensive. Offenders might be slapped, scolded, or publicly humiliated. Signs were posted, painted boards with crude images, minding all that clean breath keeps the peace. Do not shout. Loud voices were considered disruptive and rude, especially near the small chapel of St. Thomas on the bridge's midpoint, where prayers were offered for safe crossings. Respectable Londoners lowered their voices and removed their hats in this stretch, even if only for a moment, and perhaps most curious of all, yield to the fishmongers. On Fridays and fast days, fishmongers had priority access across the bridge. pushing carts of eels, salted herring, or freshwater trout toward Cheapside and the markets beyond. Etiquette demanded that others step aside, lest their toes be crushed, or their cloaks stained with brine. These rules weren't enforced by lawmen, but by the weight of custom. To violate them was to reveal yourself as a foreigner, a fool, or worse, a criminal. But what happened when the etiquette broke down, when a man refused to yield, or a noble's carriage pushed against the leftward stream? The breakdown came on a chill morning in March of 1448, when a minor nobleman, Sir Edric of Kent, tried to cross London Bridge in the wrong direction. Mounted on a pale warhorse and flanked by 2 squires, he entered from the Southwark side, and rode on the right against the steady flow of carts, pilgrims, and apprentices headed north toward the city gates. People shouted, some stepped aside, but others, irritated and cold, refused to move. Among them was a fishwife named Marjorie Bunt, well known in Southwark for her eel pies and sharp tongue. She was pushing a cart of salted haddock wrapped in reeds, bound for the Friday market. As the horseman approached, she stood firm. "Bridge keeps to left," she is said to have cried, thumping her cartwheel with a fish knife. His horse nudged forward, but as he pressed ahead, his mount's flank knocked Marjorie's cart into the foot traffic, spilling fish across the damp stones. The crowd, already agitated, surged. Someone grabbed the horse's bridle. A baker's apprentice threw a turnip. A child screamed. In moments, the bridge's fragile flow had collapsed into chaos. City guards arrived swiftly from the northern gatehouse, breaking up the scuffle with halberds and harsh words. No one was seriously injured, though Marjorie's cart was ruined, and Sir Edric's pride badly bruised. He was escorted off the bridge by the watch. Not arrested nobles rarely wormed. The incident made the court rolls under the plain heading, "Disruption of Passage," a rare entry, but a telling one. For though no written, the city recognized the importance of order, especially on the bridge that connected London to the rest of the realm. The mayor's office issued a proclamation days later: "Let none hinder the flow of the bridge, lest the king's commerce be stalled and quarrels arise." From then on, city stewards began carrying walking sticks with brass heads, tapping them gently against the ground to remind others of direction. Apprentices were scolded to memorize etiquette, and foreign merchants were quietly advised upon entry. The bridge resumed its rhythm, as all things do. Sir Edric, it said, never rode that bridge again. The unwritten rules had held just barely, but it raised a quiet question for Londoners. If civility lives not in laws but in habits, how long can those habits survive the pride of power? In the medieval city of Cologne, nestled along the Rhine, the bustling market square was the city's stomach and its nose. Each morning, beneath the towering shadow of the unfinished cathedral, stalls sprang up in neat, tightly packed rows. Cabbages stacked in pyramids, onions strung like garlands, and fruits imported from far south. But unlike today's sanitized grocery aisles, the medieval shopper didn't rely on packaging or labels. They relied on smell, and so did the law. Cologne had a curious set of civic rules known as the Nasengericht, or nose judgment. According to these ordinances, produce vendors were required to pass a smell inspection before opening for sale. The concept was simple: if peculiar, if your goods gave off an odor considered foul, sharp, or decaying, they could be seized and destroyed on the spot. More than a matter of hygiene, this was about civic pride and the presentation of the city itself, appointed by the city council. The Geruchsprüfer, or smell tester, was a unique civic role. Usually a middle-aged man with a keen sense of smell and a good standing in his guild, The tester would begin his rounds at dawn. Wearing a simple linen tunic and a badge with a city seal, he passed between stalls with deliberate slowness, lifting lids, leaning into barrels, and occasionally sniffing fingers or crates. His word was final. Records from 1383 list one such tester, Matthias Sturz, who famously rejected an entire shipment of Spanish figs for being sour of the rind and touched by rats. Another entry recounts an early summer when multiple stalls were fined for selling overripe plums, which had begun to ferment and attract hornets. In both cases, the vendors protested, but the smell tester held his ground. But what made Cologne's rules unusual wasn't just the inspection. It was the fact that the public was invited to join in. A line in the 1372 municipal ledger reads, "Let the citizen, if offended by scent, speak to the master or the tester, and the matter shall be tried by the nose." This meant that complaints could trigger impromptu smell trials right in the market square. A dissatisfied housewife might wave a leak under the nose of a city steward, or a baker might accuse a rival fruit seller of storing apples near chamber pots. The smelt tester would be summoned, sniff the goods, and pronounce judgment, often to a crowd of delighted bystanders. But what happened when a smelt tester's nose failed him more? Worse, when he was accused of favoring certain vendors. Could the nose, for all its power, be trusted to serve the market without bias? The problem began with a string of suspiciously fragrant stalls overripe, melons and squishy pears that somehow escaped seizure, while cleaner merchants found their carrots confiscated for the hint of damp. Whispers grew around the square. Was the smell tester taking bribes? In 1411, Cologne's most infamous civic scandal broke. The man at the center was Ulrich Berenschmidt, a veteran Geruchsprüfer with nearly 12 years of loyal sniffing behind him. He was known for his solemn face and wide, twitching nose, earning him the nickname the Hound. But in the summer of that year, several rival vendors brought a formal complaint to the city council. Berenschmidt, they claimed, had accepted coin and pies in exchange for leniency. One witness, a spice merchant named Greta von Lindt, testified that she'd seen Berenschmidt lick his fingers and smile after visiting a cherry vendor who sold visibly bruised stock. Another, more damaging accusation came from a rival smell tester apprentice, who claimed Ulrich had privately described certain vendors as too generous to trouble. The council convened a formal Jerichsinqueria literal investigation into smells and smell judgment. For days, civic scribes took notes as merchants reenacted scenes of fruit testing, bringing in barrels of suspect produce. Ulrich, defending himself, insisted that scent was a matter of subtlety, and what others called foulness might merely be market musk. To settle the issue, the council took a peculiar step. They gathered a panel of 5 citizens to act as secondary sniffers, placing bowls of fruit before them without disclosing which stalls they came from. If the panel judged a sample too foul to eat, and Ulrich had passed it, it would count against him. The verdict: of 17 samples, Ulrich's judgments matched the panel in 14 cases, but the 3 that failed included a basket of apricots crawling with mold. His defense: they smelled of summer and honest rot, failed to persuade. Ulrich was stripped of his badge and fined 10 florins, the equivalent of several months' wages. Yet the council did not abolish the position. Instead, it codified a new set of smeltester ethics. Testers were no longer to accept food or gifts from any merchant, and future appointees would rotate quarterly to avoid favoritism. The scandal left its mark. For decades, merchants referred to suspicious leniency as doing a Downschmidt, but the smell tester's role survived, a symbol of how even the most bodily senses, the nose, the tongue, the skin, could become instruments of civic order. Still, one might wonder, if smell is so easily swayed by mood or memory, how many market laws were decided by nothing more than a sniff before breakfast. It began with the sky. In the spring of 1258, Londoners noticed that the sun had dulled, casting no strong shadow even at midday. The light was strange, neither gray nor golden, but a pale, listless hue, as though a thin shroud had been pulled over the heavens. At first, people blamed the weather. Then they blamed sin. In the months that followed, the strangeness worsened. Rain fell in sour sheets, often tinged with dust. Crops sprouted late, then rotted in the ground. And Beijing recorded something eerily similar, a cold, dim season that came without warning and refused to leave. In England, monks in St. Albans described a sky that burned red at dawn and dusk, but yielded no warmth. They wrote of hail in June, frozen rivers in July, and peasants huddling indoors, while summer should have been in full bloom. The wheat fields failed. Barley turned black. Famine crept in like fog under the doors. No one at the time understood what had caused this sudden gloom, but the people of 13th century Europe had no shortage of theories. Some believed a comet had passed, bringing with it a cloak of divine punishment. Others feared sorcery, or that the moon itself had become infected. A few pointed fingers at lepers, or foreigners, or Jew scapegoats drawn from familiar prejudices. In London, civic officials ordered more frequent sermons. Bells tolled at odd hours. Children were not allowed to play in the streets, for fear that laughter during God's judgment would worsen the punishment. Animals were slaughtered for ritual offerings, and yet the darkness lingered. The market stalls began to empty. Fish spoiled in their barrels before they could be salted. The price of grain soared until only the wealthy could afford bread. In the manorial rolls of Essex and Kent, more deaths are recorded from starvation in the summer of 1258 than in any other summer of that century. And still the sun did not return. But what no one in medieval Europe could have known what would only be discovered centuries later was that this was not the work of the heavens at all. It was the result of a massive volcanic eruption, one so far away it remained invisible to those it starved. Somewhere in the tropics, likely Indonesia, volcano had exploded, launching dust and sulfur into the stratosphere and dimming the global sky. But how could a medieval peasant, staring at a pale midday, ever guess that their failing barley owed itself to a mountain half a world away? What else, one wonders, happened throughout history that we blamed on God when the cause was buried in ash? By the winter of 1258, the dim light had turned from troubling to terrifying. In England, entire villages were reported to have vanished, not from fire or sword, but from cold and hunger. Chronicles speak of people wandering from town to town, begging for bread, their skin loose over hollow faces. Even in the monasteries, long thought immune to the worst of famine, supplies began to run dry. In France, the river Seine froze deep, enough to walk across in November. In Germany, entire harvests failed 2 years in a row. And in Iceland, a layer of ash covered the ground, thick and oddly warm. The cold was not just seasonal, it was structural. The sun had not truly returned, and yet the cause remained a mystery. Only centuries later, with the help of ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica, would modern scientists trace the evidence back to a single, catastrophic event, the eruption of Mount Semalis, part of the Rinjani volcano complex in Indonesia. This titanic explosion, one of the largest in recorded history, sent an estimated 40 cubic kilometers of debris into the upper atmosphere far above the weather, where it drifted for years. What medieval chroniclers saw as strange fogs and red sunrises were in fact the aerosols and volcanic gases scattering sunlight. The thin, strange light of 1258 was the shadow of a distant mountain's fury. Of course, no medieval Londoner could know this. Their understanding of cause and effect was shaped by faith, not geology. What mattered to them wasn't why the sun was gone, but what they had done to deserve it. Some cities organized days of public penance. In Milan, barefoot processions wound through the streets. In England, King Henry III ordered extra alms to be given from royal stores, even as his own table shrank. One bishop proposed that the darkness was the mourning of the saints, while others believed it heralded the end of days, but it didn't end. Not for many months. The weather only slowly began to return to normal by late 1260. Even then, the famine's effects lingered. Children born in those years were smaller. The rural poor were fewer. Entire manorial systems collapsed, unable to recover from the agricultural losses, and yet, strangely, no war or rebellion emerged directly from the darkness. It was too widespread, too inexplicable. It was not a wrong that could be righted with violence only endured, which leaves us with a curious reflection. How many tragedies in history weren't caused by tyrants or armies, but by dust, ash, and silence? Imagine standing in a narrow medieval street just after sunset, the lamps unlit, the shops shuttered, the air dense with smoke from evening hearths. Somewhere in the distance, a bell begins to toll. Not for prayer, nor danger, but for something much more routine: bedtime. In many medieval cities, particularly across England and France, the day officially ended with the ringing of the curfew bell, derived from the old French phrase couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. The curfew marked the time when townsfolk were required to extinguish their hearths, shutter their homes, and retreat indoors. It wasn't merely a suggestion, it was law. In places like 13th century Oxford, this bell rang each night without fail. Once it did, no citizen could lawfully walk the streets unless they had explicit permission or an urgent reason. If you were found wandering after curfew, without explanation, you could be fined, jailed, or if you were unlucky, assumed to be a thief. Why such strict control over nighttime life? The answer lies partly in fire prevention. Most medieval homes were made of timber and thatch, highly flammable materials. One stray ember from a late-night hearth could reduce a neighborhood to ash before dawn. Cities like Winchester and Rouen had seen devastating fires that destroyed hundreds of buildings. Curfew laws ensured that cooking fires and candles were doused at a reasonable hour. But there was another reason. Nighttime was a time of fear. With no streetlights, limited policing, and abundant superstition, the dark hours were viewed as a realm of danger. It was thought that evil spirits, criminals, and outlaws operated under the cloak of night. Closing the city down after dusk was a way to reclaim order from the unknown. To enforce these rules, cities employed night watchmen, often older men or poor townsfolk, paid to patrol the streets with lanterns, staves, and sometimes dogs. Their job was simple: walk the alleys, check doors, and report trouble. They were to challenge anyone they met, ask for their business, and raise an alarm if needed. The curfew laws were often coupled with restrictions on candle usage. In some regions, residents had to pay a special tax on wax or tallow if they wished to use candles after dark. Too many candles might imply unauthorized work, gatherings, or secret worship hall, causes for suspicion. So, for most, the day ended. With the sun, a bell rings, fires are covered, candles are snuffed, a quiet settles in. But what if someone defied the curfew? Who would risk the wrath of both man and superstition to walk the empty streets by night? And what might they hope to find in the darkness? Despite the laws, the curfew bell did not silence every footstep. Some moved through the darkness because they had two midwives summoned to difficult births, priests bringing last rites, or bakers rising early to knead dough before sunrise. Others did so in secret, in defiance or desperation. The night watchmen, with their lanterns and halberds, were the thin line between lawful rest and forbidden movement. Their job was not glamorous. They were poorly paid, vulnerable, and rarely respected. Most were untrained civilians, retired soldiers, elderly craftsmen, or debtors working off fines. Still, they wielded the authority of the city. If they found you after curfew, they were required to ask, "Who goes there?" or something similar in the local tongue. If you failed to answer, ran, or gave an unsatisfactory reason, they could detain you until morning. Many believed spirits and demons roamed the alleys, especially on moonless nights. In Norwich, it was said a woman saw a black dog with eyes like lanterns disappear into the church wall. In Cologne, parents warned their children of the Nachtvogt, the night folk, who took away those who didn't sleep. But not all midnight walkers were mythical. Records from the city of York in the late 1300s describe a surprising number of arrests. After curfew, messengers carrying sealed letters, errant lovers returning from clandestine meetings, even noblemen's sons daring each other to walk past the cemetery gates. Some were spies, some were thieves, and some were simply lonely souls chasing quiet. The candle tax, though often overlooked, was another curious piece of this puzzle. Households could only burn so many candles without paying additional fees to the town. Too much light might indicate illicit reading, private prayer, or business done after hours. It was a tax on productivity itself, designed to force rest and limit secret dealings, yet many ignored it. Some covered their windows with wool or thick shutters, so no light escaped. Others used oil lamps from foreign merchants, unregulated and untaxed. In rare cases, secret gatherings were held under the flicker of illegal light, discussions of reform, heresy, or simply forbidden books. So while the city slept, small flames still danced behind closed doors, and down stone alleys, a solitary watchman might pause, hearing footsteps that should not be there. Was it a sinner, a savior, or something else entirely? And if darkness itself could be taxed, what else might a city try to control? You wake early in a medieval city not to pray or to farm, but to sell. You haul your sack of turnips to the town square, still glistening with morning dew. But when you reach the market, a man in a brown robe and wooden tally stick stops you. He points to your stallier, 6 inches out of bounds, and just like that, you're fined, not for cheating, not for stealing, but for violating the exact measurement of your allowed market space. Medieval markets were not chaotic gatherings of cheerful vendors shouting over fruit baskets. They were tightly regulated spaces, each stall designated, measured, and taxed by the municipal authorities. A vendor's place was not only marked by habit, but by peg and document, literally, a wooden stake hammered into the earth, or a stone etching on the pavement. If your cart's wheel crossed the line, if your barrel rested on another's patch, you could be reported, fined, or even banned from selling. The reason: fairness, control, and more often than not, money. City councils made income by licensing stalls, especially in larger towns like Ghent, York, or Milan. Market inspectors, sometimes called aletas or market reeves, would roam daily with rods marked in units. They were there to check measurements, enforce pricing rules, and ensure that vendors sold only what they were licensed to sell. Yes, even the type of produce mattered. In 14th century Florence, for instance, a turnip seller could not legally sell onions unless they had dual registration. Selling the wrong vegetable without permission was seen as overstepping the guild, and might offend both the onion seller and the produce guild's taxation structure. A turnip was not just a root, it was a category of commerce. Medieval cities were intensely protective of order. The chaos of famine, price inflation, or food hoarding was a constant threat, so they responded by regulating not just what was sold, but how much, where, and by whom. For example, in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, only women could sell dairy, while men were often limited to grains or butchered meats. In London, fishmongers couldn't share stalls with cheesemongers. Bakers were weighed and inspected daily, their loaves seized if too light, but the physical space itself, the boundary of a stall, became a symbol of honesty. A crooked cloth, an encroaching basket, a merchant who set up 5 minutes too early, all of these were tiny rebellions, and they did not go unnoticed. What did it feel like to measure your livelihood in inches, to fear the wooden rod of a reeve more than the cold of dawn? And what might happen to a humble turnip seller who decided to push back? The fines could start smaller, penny here, a half loaf there, but they added up quickly. In most cities, if you violated your stall's boundaries 3 times, you risked more than a scolding. You could be publicly shamed, lose your market rights, or even face temporary imprisonment. For a poor vendor, that meant losing your place in the social order and perhaps your only income. Guilds played a significant role in this enforcement, while the city officials oversaw logistics. The guilds policed behavior. You might belong to the turnip sellers guild or the broader guild of small vegetable merchants, each with its own rules and elected officers. These guilds were not just trade unions, they were enforcers of tradition, protectors of privilege, and gatekeepers of reputation. Guild officers patrolled with city reeves, watching for infractions. Selling bruised produce, guilty. Charging more than the official ceiling price, guilty. Whispering about better prices on another street, that too could be reported. And some rules weren't written down. The hierarchy within the market mattered. Older sellers had better spots closer to the fountain, where customers gathered first. Newcomers were relegated to outer corners, closer to the animal pens or the dung heaps. If you rose too quickly or encroached on another's unofficial turf, you might find your cart sabotaged or your goods slandered. Market days could turn tense. In one recorded case from 1391 in Dijon, a stall owner was dragged before the alderman for tossing wilted radishes at a rival. In London's Cheapside, a bread seller was beaten for barking prices allowed to lure customers from her neighbor. These were not just petty squabbles, they were violations of the unspoken code of the market. Even the materials used to build a stall could come under scrutiny. Cloth coverings were taxed differently from wooden roofs. Some towns prohibited permanent structures altogether, fearing fire or unfair advantage. There were rules about how high your stall could be, how wide your counter, how many assistants you were allowed. Everything from turnip to trestle was law. Yet, despite the tedium, these regulations shaped entire cities. Markets were their heart, pumping food, goods, and gossip through the streets. Enforcing stall dimensions might seem dull, but it prevented fights, maintained fairness, and upheld a delicate peace between competing interests. and behind each stall was a life rising before the sun, hoping for clear skies and kind customers. A life lived under rules both visible and invisible, so if a simple turnip seller bent the law one morning, was it really rebellion, or just the quiet plea of someone trying to survive? You stroll through the damp, narrow streets of a medieval city at dawn, the scent of freshly baked bread curling around corners like a promise. At a small stone bakery tucked between a tannery and a chapel, a baker pulls steaming loaves from the oven. Each loaf has a small, clear stamp on top, a mark as deliberate as a royal seal. That mark is not decoration, it's evidence. For centuries across Europe, bread was not just food, it was regulated sustenance, a legal commodity monitored down to the ounce. Because bread fed the poor daily, desperately it had to be protected. The authorities needed to ensure that no baker short changed the people. And so, just as a goldsmith marked silver or a monarch signed a charter, bakers too had to mark their loaves in England. This was enshrined by the Assize of Bread and Ale, first issued in 1266 and refined over the centuries. The law dictated exact bread weights relative to grain prices. When wheat was cheap, loaves had to be heavy. When grain was costly, loaves shrank. But no matter the market, bakers were bound to follow the official charter, face the harsh consequences. To enforce this, each baker had to stamp their bread with a unique symbol. Some used initials, others used a family crest or an emblem passed down for generations: sheaf of wheat, a crossed peel and shovel, a lion holding a loaf. The marks were often cut into wood or metal and pressed into the soft dough before baking. Once marked, the loaf became traceable. If someone reported underweight bread, officials could find the baker by the stamp and conduct an inquiry. Often, city inspectors, known as alekoners or bread weighers, would purchase loaves from markets and test them by weight or feel. If found wanting, they'd return to the baker's door, sometimes accompanied by armed guards. The punishment: fines, public humiliation, or worse. Bakers caught cheating might be forced to sit in the stocks with their own bread hung around their necks. Some were even paraded through the streets, their loaves tossed to the crowd in mockery. And for repeat offenders, a dunk in the river or jail time wasn't unheard of. Still, not all violations were malicious. Inconsistent ovens, spoiled flour, mismeasured dough could cause accidental infractions. But law was law. The stamp on a loaf wasn't just a name, it was a contract between baker and town. So, as you hold that crusty, golden loaf in your hands, its soft stamp just barely visible, you might wonder, was this baker careful out of pride or fear? The laws surrounding bread weren't just about fairness, they were about trust. Bread was central to survival, and in many towns, it was the only reliable daily food. A dishonest baker didn't just risk fines, they threatened the balance of an entire community. But there was another side to the story, one where the baker gave more than they took. To guard against honest mistakes and keep peace with the law, bakers developed a strange custom. They made an extra loaf. This 13th loaf, offered for every dozen sold, was called the inbread, the vantage loaf, or more commonly, the baker's dozen. It was both a cushion and a quiet apology, a way to avoid suspicion or punishment if one loaf happened to fall slightly underweight. This ghost loaf wasn't always sold. Sometimes it was given to the poor, left at a church, or offered to the guild as a tithe. It became a symbol not of greed, but of prudence and charity, a way to maintain honor in a profession constantly scrutinized. And charity ran deeper still. Many cities required bakers to set aside the bread of pity, a designated portion of loaves distributed to the elderly, the sick, or travelers who could not afford food. These loaves were stamped with different marks or left unmarked, but everyone knew their purpose. They were often made from leftover dough, but still fresh, still warm, still life-giving. Guilds oversaw this distribution, and disputes could arise over who qualified. But even in the midst of rules and measurements, something human endured. A baker, up before sunrise, could choose to make 1 extra loaf, or 5. No law required kindness, yet many chose it. This complex system stamps, standards, inspections, and ghost loaves created a world where bread was both bureaucratic and deeply personal. Every mark told a story, a family name passed down, a symbol of resistance, or simply a reminder to weigh carefully and bake true. Some towns even kept public bread scales, large balancing devices in the marketplace where customers could check the weight of their loaves. If a loaf was light, a clerk would record the mark, and the baker could face consequences. But sometimes, a customer knowing the baker, knowing their struggle, might say nothing. It was a small act of mercy in a city built on rigid fairness. So, when you next imagine a medieval town, don't just picture castles and knights. Picture the warm glow of an oven at dawn. Picture the careful hand stamping a symbol into dough. Picture the silent promise, this loaf is honest. But ask yourself, what happens to a city when even the bread cannot be trusted? As the sun slips behind the rooftops of a medieval city, a deep, sonorous bell begins to toll from the tower at the town square. The sound carries over markets and muddy alleys, past cloisters and thatched homes. It's not a church bell. Not tonight. This is the curfew bell, and with it comes a sudden transformation. Shutters are drawn, doors are barred, fires are dampened. The day has ended, not by the rhythm of nature, but by order of law. The word curfew comes from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. Originally, this referred quite literally to the extinguishing of hearth flames to prevent accidental blazes during the night. In densely built medieval cities where homes were timber-framed and roofs were thatched, a fire left unattended could consume entire neighborhoods in hours. Thus, the bell tolled to remind citizens to cover their fires, often using a special iron lid, and to withdraw from the public square. In places like Norman England and much of France, these bells rang at fixed times, sometimes as early as 8 p.m., sometimes later, depending on the season and region. Once the bell rang, it became illegal to roam the streets without a very good reason. City gates were locked. Guards took their posts. If you were found outside after curfew, you might be questioned, fined, or even jailed. Travelers arriving late were often forced to sleep just beyond the walls, huddled in inns or makeshift camps, listening to the town's life settle behind the closed gate. But curfew wasn't only about fire. Prevention, it was also about control. In times of political unrest, plague, or suspicion of crime, curfew could be moved earlier or enforced more harshly. It became a way for authorities to regulate behavior, to draw invisible lines between order and chaos. Inside homes, the mood shifted after the bell. No more market haggling or public gossip. No church processions or alehouse laughter. Just candlelight, quiet prayer, and the ticking hum of domestic life. For many, it was a time of rest, was when their work began. Sometimes, a second bell would ring later in the night, signaling final silence. In monastic towns, this could also serve as a signal for night prayers, blending civic duty with spiritual rhythm. Still, one wonders, in a world so governed by natural light, why did people accept the tyranny of the bell? Was it safety, or simply the comfort of knowing the day had rules? Once the curfew bell tolled and darkness wrapped the city, the streets became a different world, one of whispers, muffled steps, and unspoken danger. In medieval towns, nighttime was not meant for wandering. If you were outside after the bell, you were either important or suspicious, and the line between the two could blur easily. City authorities often employed watchmen or night constables who patrolled the alleys with lanterns, staves, and a long list of questions. Their duty was to stop anyone they encountered and demand an explanation. Who goes there? What is your business? Why are you abroad at this hour? Answers had to be swift and satisfactory. A midwife on her way to a birth might pass. A merchant returning late from a journey might be warned. But a stranger, a vagrant, or someone carrying no tools of trade, they could be arrested on suspicion alone. The danger was real. Robbers and cutpurses preferred the cover of darkness. So did secret lovers and forbidden gatherings. The curfew created a curiously stark division. By day, the town belonged to everyone. By night, it belonged to no one, or everyone with a secret. Even more frightening were fires, which often began in silence. A knocked-over candle, an untended cooking hearth, or a spark from a forge could smolder through the night, unnoticed until flames burst through timber beams. With the curfew came the requirement to extinguish indoor fires, but not everyone obeyed. Some feared the cold more than the law to reach all districts. In some towns, they were accompanied by trumpets or watch horns, a layered soundscape of medieval caution. Certain cities kept a night book, a ledger of those found violating curfew. Over time, these books served as strange historical records of fear, love, desperation, and mistake. But curfew had softer echoes too. For the law-abiding, it created a structure for sleep, a boundary for the mind. When the bell rang, the world became small and still. A family might gather around the hearth one last time, say their prayers, and rest knowing that the bell controlled plague, famine, war. Did people cling to curfew for safety, or simply because it gave the illusion of order? When you think of medieval cities, you might imagine castles, cobblestone alleys, and bustling markets. But beneath the noise and trade, an invisible web held everything in place. The guilds. These were not just trade associations, they were governments within the city deciding who could work, how, and when. Nearly every craft had its guild: shoemakers, blacksmiths, tailors, carpenters, chandlers, candlemakers, bakers, weavers. Each profession was structured like a miniature kingdom, complete with rules, hierarchy, apprenticeships, and even its own feasts and saints' days. Let's say you were a young boy in 13th century Cologne and you dreamed of making shoes. You couldn't just pick up some leather and start stitching. First, you'd need to become an apprentice, living in the home of a master shoemaker, working long hours for years, often for little more than room, board, and discipline. You swept floors, cleaned tools, ran errands, and watched closely. Gradually, you'd learn the craft. After your apprenticeship, you might be promoted to journeyman, allowed to work for pay, but still under the supervision of masters. Only after producing a masterpiece, a work of exceptional skill, and proving your moral standing, could you become a master and open your own shop. But even then, your freedom was limited. The guild decided how many masters could work in the city, how much you could charge, what materials you must use, whether you could sell on feast days. And if you violated these rules, they could fine you or worse, expel you from the guild. effectively ending your career. Guilds also operated as social safety nets. If a member fell ill, the guild might provide care or cover burial costs. Widows and orphans of deceased members might be supported. In this way, the guild was more than an economic system, it was a community, with its own traditions, symbols, and even secret hand signs in some cases. Each guild had a hall, often one of the most impressive buildings in the city, where meetings were held and disputes were settled. Some halls contained chapels, others had banqueting halls decorated with elaborate coats of arms, and every guild had a patron saint, a divine protector for their craft. Saint Crispin for shoemakers, Saint Elias for metalworkers, Saint Catherine for spinners and wheelwrights. The power of guilds stretched beyond the workshop. They influenced city councils, backed laws, funded cathedrals, and even sponsored plays and public feasts. In many cities, guild representatives had political voting power, especially in northern Italy and the Low Countries. Still, for all their organization, one can't help but ask, were these guilds truly serving the craft, or quietly serving themselves? While guilds shaped much of medieval urban life, not everyone saw them as noble protectors of craft. Behind the carved doors of the guild halls, a quiet world of competition, secrecy, and manipulation often unfolded, hidden behind layers of tradition and fine words. At first glance, the rules guilds enforced seemed fair: quality control, fair wages, and protection of skills. But over time, these same rules were used to exclude newcomers, protect monopolies, and ensure that only a small circle of insiders could thrive. In cities like Bruges or Paris, a master with political connections could block talented journeymen from ever rising, claiming their masterpiece wasn't quite up to standard no matter how fine the work. Guilds were also jealous of their secrets. Recipes for dyes, techniques for shaping glass, or patterns for weaving silk were guarded as closely as royal treasure. To leak a method was to betray not just the craft, but the entire fraternity. Punishments could range from public shaming to permanent blacklisting. Some guilds, like the goldsmiths or the stonemasons, held almost mystical reputations, speaking in hushed symbols and codes. In these rarefied circles, secrecy blurred into ritual, and ritual into power. These traditions would later inspire the early whispers of Freemasonry, though in the Middle Ages, they were more about controlling knowledge than sharing enlightenment. Corruption crept in, as it always does. Fake guilds occasionally sprang up, imitating real ones to take dues from gullible apprentices. Wealthy merchants bribed their way into leadership positions. Some guilds grew so bloated with rules and rituals that they forgot their purpose entirely. The work itself, as the centuries wore on, change knocked at the doors of the guild halls. New tools, new trade routes, new ideas. The printing press allowed techniques to spread beyond the gatekeeping of master craftsmen. Merchant capitalism, rising in cities like Florence and Antwerp, began to undermine the guild monopoly on labor. By the 16th century, reformers accused guilds of stifling innovation and inflating prices. In response, some guilds tightened control, becoming more exclusive, even paranoid. Others opened up, hoping to survive. But many simply faded, leaving behind empty halls and dusty ledgers, proof of a world where rules once meant everything. Still, traces of them remain. The surnames, Carrismith, Baker, Mason, Tanner, are echoes of guild professions. Even modern labor unions owe a strange debt to these ancient alliances of skill and regulation. And so we ask, were guilds the guardians of craftsmanship, or the quiet architects of inequality? In the quiet dawn of a medieval city, before the market stalls clattered to life, something else stirred in the alleys and drains. Waste, human, animal, industrial, it was everywhere. For all the grandeur of cathedrals and castles, the cities of the Middle Ages were also built atop layers of filth, managed through a bewildering array of local rules, social customs, and the simple act of holding one's nose. The most common medieval toilet was the cesspit, a pit dug beneath or near a home or public building. These were often located in backyards or beneath outhouses, sometimes no more than a wooden seat over a hole. Privileged homes might have stone-lined latrines, or even vertical chutes, dropping waste into a pit or moat below. But for the average townsfolk, it was simpler. Use a bucket, then empty it in the street, or into a ditch. Or if one was feeling particularly responsibly to the local river. The rules around waste varied from city to city, and were enforced with surprising seriousness. In London, for example, by the 14th century, there were ordinances banning the dumping of dung into the Thames. In Paris, citizens were required to shout warnings, like Gardelou, before tossing waste from windows. These rules were often ignored. Then, there were the tanners, who worked with hides, removing hair, softening flesh, and preparing leather. Their trade was essential to medieval life, but it also produced a staggering stench. The process involved soaking hides in urine, animal dung, and sometimes even pigeon droppings. Tanners were typically banished to the edges of town, downstream from water supplies and far from polite society. In some towns, tanners doubled as waste managers, collecting urine from public barrels for use in the curing process. This led to a strange economic system where residents were encouraged to donate their household waste to the tanning industry. You might pass a barrel labeled Fuller's, only not for grain, but for collecting pee. Despite these efforts, the smells could not be contained. Public latrines were built in some wealthier cities' communal seats over rivers or streams, but even these could back up. Streets often ran with a mix of rainwater, refuse, and decay. Pigs, chickens, and dogs roamed freely, adding their own contributions. And yet, somehow, people adapted. Perfumed herbs were hung in doorways. Incense was burned in churches. Spices were chewed or worn as jewelry. In a world without plumbing or soap as we know it, managing filth became both a public duty and a private ritual. Still, you might wonder, was cleanliness truly next to godliness, or simply a luxury only the wealthy could afford? The struggle against medieval waste was not just physical, it was political. Smell had meaning. It was tied to class, to morality, and even to law. A clean street wasn't just a pleasant one. It was a sign of control, of status, and of divine order. A foul odor, that was a warning, a symptom of sin or neglect or both. In some cities, waste management fell under specific offices. The Garde des Beaux in Paris, for instance, oversaw street cleaning and cesspit maintenance. In England, local bylaws dictated how and where one could build a privy, often requiring it be placed a certain distance from neighbors' walls or water sources. If a cesspit overflowed into a neighbor's property, or worse, their wealthy, fines could be severe. In some cases, the offending privy was ordered destroyed. Public complaints about stench were taken seriously. In 14th century London, a man named John de la Riviere was fined for keeping a dung heap so large it was affecting the nearby churchgoers. In York, a fishmonger was penalized for tossing guts into the street. Smell was treated not just as a nuisance, but a public offense, a sign of disorder, and potentially disease. Yet hypocrisy abounded. Wealthy households might complain of the tanner's stink, even while dumping their own chamber pots into the same alley. Privies were sometimes attached to the walls of upper floors, with waste dropping down into shared channels or worse, the street. The phrase night soil referred to waste collected by latrine men who worked at night, often for little pay and with few protections, for the tanners and butchers. Their professions were simultaneously essential and despised. Some towns allowed them to work only on specific days, or demanded they operate during certain hours. The smell of their trade was considered proof of their lowly status, yet the city needed their leather, their meat, their glue. Over time, city councils attempted improvements. Covered drains were installed. Stone-lined sewers were introduced. In some wealthier quarters, shared privies were maintained by local parishes, but true sanitation remained rare. Disease often spread through unclean water or poor waste handling. Not that people fully understood the link, and yet, amidst all this, life continued. Children played near cesspits, markets bustled beside tanneries, weddings and festivals were held mere steps from dung heaps. The urban medieval world had learned, awkwardly and imperfectly, to live with its own decay. Still, one must ask, in a city where the air itself could condemn or elevate you, how much of daily life was spent just trying to breathe a little easier? Before the tick of mechanical gears and the swing of a pendulum, time in medieval cities was measured by something far more ancient and communal, the sound of bells. Long before most people could afford a clock or even understood the concept of minutes and seconds, time was kept by rhythms of light and dark, prayer and labor, bell and silence. At the heart of many towns stood a bell tower, often attached to a church or city hall. These bells marked the passage of time, not in numbers, but in events. A bell in the morning might signal the start of labor, one at sunset, the curfew. It was called couvre-feu, in Old French, literally cover fire, a warning for townspeople to extinguish open flames and retreat indoors. Over time, the word became simply curfew. This evening bell served as both a practical safety measure and a means of social control. Fire was a constant threat in towns made mostly of wood and thatch. An unattended flame could consume an entire street before help arrived. The bell reminded residents to dampen hearths, douse torches, and prepare for night when crime, mischief, and the unknown were thought to roam more freely. But the bell did more than tell people when to sleep. It regulated the entire day. Monks and nuns followed a strict liturgical schedule known as the Divine Office, marked by 8 canonical hours: matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. Towns and tradespeople, too, often borrowed this rhythm, though in a far more relaxed form. Timekeeping, in this sense, was fluid, based on natural cues, the sun's position, the length of shadows, or the crowing of roosters. But as cities grew more complex, the need for greater precision emerged. Bell ringers, often monks or hired laymen, had to be attentive, watching the sky, checking hourglasses, or marking time by dripping candles and water clocks. Some towns employed bell ordinators, officials responsible for making sure bells rang at the right intervals. In a world without wristwatches or hourly chimes, the bell was both clock and conscience. Its toll could announce market openings, military musters, or even executions. People waited for it. They set their meals, their labors, and their rest around it. The bell was, quite literally, the sound of order, but one must wonder what happened in those moments when the bell was late or never rang at all. In time, the bell gave way to something quieter, but no less powerful: the clock. As the late medieval period ushered in advancements in engineering and astronomy, mechanical clocks began to appear in cathedrals, monasteries, and public squares. These early machines were enormous, often weight-driven and regulated by water, sand, or even ropes wound around spools. Their ticking was not always accurate, but it was consistent in iron heartbeat over the rooftops. Cities like Milan, Strasbourg, and Salisbury boasted clock towers by the 14th century. Some struck a bell at regular intervals, while others had intricate dials and figures that moved with the hour. But these marvels were expensive and rare, and still, for most people, the bell remained the true timekeeper. Yet, even the bell had its quiet days. In times of war, famine, or plague, bells fell silent. During outbreaks of the Black Death, many bell towers went unmanned. The sound that had shaped the rhythm of everyday life was replaced by stillness, or worse, the echo of cartwheels carrying the dead. Without the bell, townspeople lost more than a schedule. They lost a sense of shared time, of knowing when it was safe to gather, pray, or rest. And still, time marched on. Eventually, small domestic clocks became more common. Wealthy merchants and clergy kept timepieces in their homes, though they often had to be wound daily and reset based on the church bell. By the 15th century, clockmakers were crafting portable timepieces, laying the groundwork for the watches and clocks we know today. But something curious happened. As timekeeping became more precise, life became more fragmented. Where once people moved with the sun or the bell's toll, now minutes and hours could be sliced and scheduled, bought and sold. The communal rhythm gave way to personal time. Still, for centuries, the bell remained the most trusted voice in the city. Its ring meant warmth, safety, duty, or alarm. It reminded bakers to stoke their ovens and guards to shut the city gates. It told lovers when to part and monks when to kneel. And at day's end, it called all to rest. Even now, in quiet villages and ancient towns, some bells still toll at dusk. Their sound is softer now, sometimes drowned beneath traffic or forgotten altogether. But if you listen closely, you might still hear it, that slow, measured echo, folding gently into the night, marking not the hour, but a memory.